Viewer discretion is advised. Prologue continued. Bad things come in threes. 1950. Petrovka, Russia. Theme 1. Part 2. As we come back to the beginning of our story, we remember a young boy. A boy named Marcos. Now, with darkness occupying every inch of the shelter, all that could be seen or heard was a large figure slowly staggering through the bloody patterns left on the cold concrete ground. Lit by what little moonlight had shone through, the creature made its way out of the small shack into the forest of birch trees. It had been nearly an hour since Marcos made his way into the little shack, and now darkness had moved in and made itself at home across the skies above. The dark surroundings slowly formed a delicate union with the incoming rays of moonlight effortlessly shining away, filling the cold air with a somber, eerie glow. Barely able to move, the creature persisted, only eventually collapsing on the cold, dark gravel below. The beast was nearly 10 feet tall, very thin, and had several appendages, 8 arms and 2 large legs. Its entire body appeared to be made of black fluid, with what seemed like an absence of skin to keep it all in. At a closer look, the liquid body of this creature moved constantly, forming a jagged surface almost reptilian in appearance. Constant and dim flickers of light flowed through its dark body, systematically displaying the beast's entire vascular network. Suddenly, the creature looked up as it heard something approach, and was met with the dog that Marcos had found earlier. The black Rottweiler bared its teeth as it snarled and let out a bark. The creature's face appeared to be a glossy, dark liquid bubble, the shape of an oval, with a shield rising behind its neck. Like that of a rhinoceros, as it peered toward the canine threat. The dog kept guard as the creature's head began to glow red from deep within its skull, and the front of its face began to swirl like a fiery whirlpool. As it pulsated red, razor-sharp teeth appeared as the figure quickly rose and lunged for the poor small animal, who did not have time to react or make an escape. Suddenly, a gunshot sounded, and the attacking creature tumbled down the small bank and landed in a wash about 20 feet away. From a distance, 2 men began speaking in Russian. As their voices came closer, it was clear they were seeking the dog that was still barking. Annika, Annika, here, girl. Another voice came from an even closer distance. She found it. It's here. The creature, now subdued and slowly attempting to reposition itself, peered up at a soldier while his friend eventually joined him and hissed at the 2 men. It's still too sick to defend itself. Get it back in the cage. Just then, the other Russian soldier spoke up. Wait, do you hear that? Hear what? His partner questioned, but seeming to be convinced that he had heard a small voice nearby, he spoke up again once more. I heard something. I thought I heard a voice ask for help. Quiet down for a minute. The two men stood there trading glances at one another while keeping an eye on the creature. Just as they were about to forget the whole thing, it happened again. A small cry for help. They looked at each other in shock, and then down at the creature. Did it just ask for help? It sounded like a small child. While saying this, the other man kneeled and removed something from the sickly creature's grasp. It was a small human shoe. The two looked at each other in horror, realizing the sounds they were hearing were exactly that of a small child. And that sound, as soft as it was, had been emanating from within the creature's belly before them. They immediately surrounded the beast and began cutting its abdomen open, ignoring the horrifying screams it let out from the sheer pain of having its insides systematically turned inside out. Soon, the entire darkened forest was filled with the unholy screams of pure pain as the cold September winds swept the creature's sounds up with them, eventually leading to a dark and quiet stillness. But then, there was light. At first, the light was just a fuzzy white blur, but eventually, odd surroundings began to take their places as an unfamiliar man began to materialize from within the blurred shapes. Whoever this man was, he began to speak through a face mask he had been wearing, appearing to be some sort of medical professional. As he lowered his mask, he smiled as he continued speaking, as the objects and colors around him kept taking on new shades and shapes. "Little boy, can you hear me?" The man with the face mask and eyeglasses questioned, while staring hopefully at a small child before him. "Hello there. What's your name?" Marcos, a small, raspy voice, managed to respond. Then, the little boy swiftly passed out once more. The man in the mask then fully removed his face covering, now showing a much larger smile. Marcos was laying on a medical stretcher, unconscious and pale as a ghost, appearing completely dead. The man looked up at the two Russian soldiers that had earlier freed the young boy from his sticky would-be grave. They stood on the opposite side of the stretcher that held Marcos and gave the smiling doctor a confused and stern expression. "Is he dead?" one of the soldiers asked. The man in the glasses, who was not wearing a uniform, but instead was suited up in a hazmat outfit, let out a small laugh and responded to the question posed by the soldier. "No, quite the opposite, in fact. He is alive. Alive and well. Doesn't look that way, doctor. Looks dead to me. This is a miracle. You see, before these creatures digest, a protective layer inside of them attempts to imprint on its meal. If the prey resists, the subject is discarded as it is potentially harmful. Our little boy here did not resist, as he is not properly equipped to do so. But before the digestion took place, the creature's vital organs began shutting down. The boy should have been dissolved in a shower of acid. Instead, he laid here unconscious in the belly of this beast, only to find you two cutting him out hours later. Okay, fine. But what about all of that? A soldier impatiently questioned while gesturing to a sizable hole in the small boy's skull. The doctor smiled and responded without pause. That is the beautiful part, gentlemen. Since the imprint had taken place, the boy was able to regenerate cells at a much more rapid rate. In fact, he is regenerating right now as we speak. And since the creature's vital organs began shutting down, the holding pattern he left his prey in acted like a life support to our little Marcos here. This boy will live for hundreds of years. Alright, so the kid's got magical healing powers. Good for him. How does this help us with the threat of more of these things arriving any day now? They've already taken out this entire town. I'm sure they'll be back for more. The doctor smiled once again as he replied, "Yes, I always save the best for last." he said, as he pulled out a small tape recorder from his pocket. He hit play, and suddenly the small medical room was filled with echoes of clicking sounds and hisses. The native tongue of the foreign creatures. Just then, Marcos sat up, still unconscious, and began speaking the visitor's language fluently, hissing and clicking with ease, as if he knew the language his entire short life. The doctor stopped the tape as the three men watched Marcos fall back to the bed as if nothing had happened. The soldiers, now wide-eyed, looked at the doctor with shock. "Gentlemen, this little boy can communicate with the rest of this species." Doing so, simply within his mind. The doctor then focused his gaze back to Marcos and continued speaking, this time in a more serious tone and slightly under his breath. "We just have to steer him in the right way. Train him to coax our new friends here into a relationship with us. A relationship that puts us in control. We must train him to be our first ambassador to our newest and most deadly ally." Then, the doctor looked back up at the two Russian soldiers and spoke more clearly, regaining his smile along the way. "Gentlemen, this boy is going to broker us a deal with our new friends." "2033, Nueva Armenia, Ecuador, about 35 miles south of Zancudo. Thing 2, Part 2. The small village was made up of only a handful of residences. The smoke from the blast several miles north, just hours ago, began to settle in without being noticed. The small community was home to several families that lived very simple lives off and far away from any grid the rest of the planet was familiar with. 10 to 12 homes lined the Rio Napo, another one of Ecuador's murky rivers. As the evening settled in, so did the typical tranquility that the townspeople were so accustomed to. This silence, however blissful it was quickly set aside by the sounds of heavy machinery that began to fill the air. These sounds, now echoing throughout the entire jungle below, announced the descending fleet of American helicopters, which now claimed the town's entire airspace above. Within minutes, the entire small village was shut down with military personnel guarding the roadways leading in and out of the handful of meandering dirt roads. Lights flooded the skies, and the jungles below slowly began to resemble the first community within the impending pandemic, on lockdown, quarantined from the rest of the global populace. A white tent now stood tall in the center of the dark and tiny community as it radiated light around its entire structure from the powerful fluorescence within. Inside sat several medical crates amidst several people in hazmat suits. They had some of the residents already inside being examined as they continued monitoring for symptoms. They did so, knowing what dangers the smoke had carried with it just hours earlier. "Sergeant, sir, Agent Brooks just landed and is waiting for you in the command center," a soldier stated as he walked through the tent's entrance. An officer sitting behind a table looked up. "Agent Brooks has nothing to do with this operation." "Whose orders, Lieutenant?" The officer that had just announced Arlo's appearance responded. "He didn't say, just said it's urgent, sir." Sergeant Harris looked at him more seriously. Is he alone?" The question gained the attention of everyone else wearing uniforms inside, as they all looked to the lieutenant. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir." Sergeant Harris looked upset and yelled an order. "Miller, you're with me. Lieutenant, take over in my absence." The nervous petty officer nodded his head and replied, as another soldier nearby, Private Miller, rushed to the sergeant's side. "Of course, sir." "Yes, sir." A few moments later, Sergeant Harris and Private Miller were approaching the command center tent. It was a much smaller tent, surrounded by large military trucks and guarded by 2 armed soldiers. A helicopter was landed nearby, still winding down from transporting the agent inside, who was now within the tent, awaiting the 2 officers. Harris and Miller entered the tent while they watched the 2 armed guards at the entrance as they did so. Now inside, Sergeant Harris saw Arlo sitting behind a desk that was originally meant for himself. He looked at Arlo, not concerned with the fact that he was sitting in his own chair, but seemingly still nervous about being in the tent, nearly alone with this infamous American agent. Arlo was poring over the sergeant's notes that had been left on the desk in the form of a binder. Then he looked up at Harris and addressed the nervous high-ranking officer. "I thought we talked about this, Harris." Harris swallowed the thick lump in his throat he had been ignoring for the past few moments and replied, "If this virus gets out, we will be playing right into the Russians' hands. This is what they want." "Shh," Arlo interrupted him, as he signaled Harris to join him at the desk, beckoning him with a hand gesture to come closer. Harris nervously responded, "Please, Arlo, just shh." Again, Arlo interrupted him. And again, Arlo gestured for Harris to join him at the desk. Harris looked at Miller as they both exchanged hopeless glances at one another. Harris moved forward and joined Arlo across from him at the desk. Harris tried his best once more to reason with Arlo. "Sir, Quiet, now please." "Sergeant Harris," Arlo interrupted once more. He then looked at Sergeant Harris with a most serious expression within his eyes. "Remove your hat, Sergeant." For some reason, Harris was opposed to this idea as he tried reasoning with him a final time. "Look, we can't just—" "Your hat, now, please," Arlo demanded once more. Then, finally, a reluctant Harris slowly looked back at Miller and then back at Arlo. He nervously removed his hat. "There, that wasn't so bad now, was it?" Arlo commented as Harris came up with his next attempt to form an argument. "Sir, we..." But before he could speak any further, Arlo took over the narrative once more. "What? We? There is no we," Arlo stated as he leaned in and lowered his voice. He slowly placed both his hands on Harris's head and began to caress his shaven scalp. He began to whisper, "In this room, I only see me and my new Staff Sergeant Miller." Then, the sounds of bones could be heard as Harris's eyes turned dark red with blood. Miller closed his eyes and looked away quietly, trying his best not to be next. Arlo stared at Harris, and with the sergeant's skull still in his clutches, he continued to whisper to the officer, sitting across from him, having his skull slowly crushed. Arlo said his next words slowly and sternly. "When I say the virus is to be left alone, I mean precisely that." A trail of blood began to leak from both of Harris's eyes as the sergeant slowly began convulsing. Arlo closed his eyes as he actively crushed the life out of his victim while finishing his thoughts on the matter. "Why do you think I sent Salvador in? To get more samples from the creature you hold hostage? That creature, as you so often put it, is not your prisoner anymore. None of them are. Of course, I would have preferred it to have gone much smoother. The creature should still be alive. But the Pentagon has its policies, bureaucracies, Am I right? So, they insisted on Charlie bringing the detonation codes along for the trip. Nevertheless, I went forward with the plan, surely by switching out Salvador's equipment, causing him to unknowingly inject DX4 into the creature's body upon retrieving the samples. It would be strong enough to overcome this challenge and take Charlie out before detonation could take place. As tremors swept across Harris's entire body, he saw Arlo look up as if to reference the skies above, just outside. And while he let out his last dying breath, he could hear Arlo's final words on the subject as his world went dark. This will work just as well, though. The smoke from its burning carcass still laying in Zancudo is more than enough to spread the virus just as quickly. Miller noticed Arlo grow a small smile, as if he were listening to soft classical music, while the sounds of crushing bones led the rest of the conversation between the three. Suddenly, Arlo removed his hands from the sergeant's skull and opened his eyes to watch Harris's lifeless cranium come crashing down, face first, onto the hard, metallic desk surface. Arlo then shifted his eyes up to Miller and changed his entire persona as if nothing had happened. Officer Miller, you have just been promoted. Harris is going to be taking leave. Miller quickly saluted Arlo. Yes, sir. Arlo stood up and passed Miller as he exited the tent. He turned around and looked at Miller once more. Move your men out, Arlo ordered. I have already advised the Pentagon on Harris's behalf. There was no threat to neutralize. Zul is in good status and will be permanently shut down. And this conversation, Arlo gestured to Harris's body, now lifeless and face down on his desk, never took place. Miller stood nervously in the tent, still saluting the now empty room, trying not to look at his former supervisor, as he heard Arlo's helicopter blades begin to warm up for departure just outside. "2052, Somewhere Over the Atlantic. Thing 3, Part 2. Senator Lee wiped her tears as she looked away from her husband and resumed the conversation with her staff. Suddenly, and without any warning, the plane hit extremely heavy turbulence that took everyone by surprise. As Lee addressed her staff with urgency, "Where's Jackson? Where is the president?" the senator asked. Her staff scrambled on their laptops. As one of them, Ben, spoke up. "They're not far from us. They're over the Atlantic as well." The senator again spoke, but with more of a direction in her voice this time. "Get her up on the screen," she yelled, and upon hitting another unnatural and forceful gust of wind, she added a few more words as she shouted once more, "Right now." Meanwhile, aboard Air Force One, President Jackson, still poring over the dossiers of Brooks and Shields in front of her, was distracted by one of her staff. "Madam President, it's Senator Lee." Suddenly, a screen behind her desk lit up and was filled with a warped picture that seemed to have members of Lee's staff trying to address the president.
A-Day. Please come in. We are being engaged.
The president and her staff watched helplessly while the screen turned to static as the signal was then quickly lost. Jackson looked at her staff. How much time do we have? The group of officials, however, remained silent. But then the president shifted her eyes to one of her generals. General Beckett, how much time before the Russians are at our doorstep? She inquired. The general looked to Vice President Brady and then back at the president herself, as if confused why he would need to make such an obvious statement. Madam President, the Russians have already breached our shores. They are not expected at our doorstep. They are now within our borders. Everyone shared nervous glances as the president let out an audible sigh. Just then, without warning, the plane hit what felt like heavy turbulence of their own. One of the flight crew entered the room and whispered in the general's ear. The general turned to the president and addressed her. Madam President, we have to land the plane. The president looked at the general and responded with a sense of annoyance in her breath. That's ridiculous. We're much safer in the air, General. We can sustain flight for the next 2 days. Beckett agreed with a head nod, but did not change his argument as he continued. Yes, Madam President, I agree. However, it's not us flying the plane anymore. He then pressed a button on the president's desk, which in turn opened a window across the room, allowing the earliest lights of the morning dawn to filter in. They both could see the absence of their previous American escort, which was replaced by several Russian MiGs, as a large Russian carrier in the Atlantic Ocean below quickly came into view. The president slowly got up and joined the general in observing what they now saw as their final fate gliding effortlessly right outside. She peered out the window while she watched history make its deadliest turn, as their vengeful counterparts now held democracy firmly in its clutches. How many agents do we have on board, General? The president quietly asked. The general just whispered with a sigh. Not nearly enough. Vice President Brady then spoke up. We need to hide the president. General Beckett was about to respond as they felt their aircraft hit the floating fortress's tarmac from underneath their feet. Immediately, they all spun around at a large noise that had hit the bulletproof window they had all been looking through earlier. Mr. Channing, being a scientist, took special interest in what happened next. A large yellow stain, seemingly being the consistency of thick syrup, began to spread on the exterior side of the glass. Channing slowly approached the window in amazement as the liquid effortlessly boiled through the 7 layers of bulletproof panes. Once on the inside of the plane, the ooze slid down the interior wall as it proceeded to boil. Channing looked at the window as if in a trance. It wasn't even cracked, yet the liquid seeped straight through all 9 reinforced glass layers with ease. He was bewildered by the strange chemical now inside the plane. He was so amazed, in fact, that he had completely overlooked the toxic gas emanating from the boiling yellow puddle below their feet. He began to feel strangely comfortable with his surroundings as he looked over at the general and then to the president. He tried fighting this unwelcomed sense of tranquility as he began to feel like a fly stuck on the sticky leaves of a carnivorous plant. Unable to regain his focus or his faculties, he watched, strangely, at peace, while his colleagues collapsed to the floor, one at a time. Eventually, his world went completely dark, but Channing, now feeling completely at ease, simply didn't seem to mind. Suddenly, he found himself coming to. The previous sense of tranquility was now completely absent as several new emotions began to take hold. Fear, depression, and utter hopelessness set in as he tried to make sense of his new surroundings. It was pitch dark as he could hear the heavy sounds of a large metal door beginning to open. Eventually, a hood was lifted over his face, and he was met with the sight of several Russian soldiers holding rifles. He was kneeling in a row with the other captives, the general right next to him still hooded. As the Russian proceeded to take all their hoods off, he noticed that the president was no longer with them. Channing's heart then sank as a thought displayed within his mind. We have failed. There were 6 of them detained as everyone else had been executed upon exiting the plane. Then, suddenly, Alex looked up to see someone walk in. It was a slender man in a black suit. He was white, but had tanned skin and maintained a very short trimmed mustache and beard, nearly coming across as simply a 5 o'clock shadow. It was none other than Arlo Brooks himself. Arlo smiled and walked toward the general. He knelt and began caressing the general's scalp through his full head of hair. Well, isn't this something? The general did not show any fear as he looked up and addressed Arlo. I'm not afraid of a coward and a traitor. Arlo laughed and was just about to reply to the general, but Alex Channing spoke up and redirected the conversation with one name he let slip from his tongue. Marcos? Arlo spun around and barked an order in Russian, cueing the nearest soldier to aim his gun at the outspoken staffer. He then slowly approached Alex and knelt beside him. He peered at the president's aide, the scientist-turned politician, who was nervously looking back at him. I beg your pardon. Alex mustered up the last bit of courage he had within him in order to address Arlo. That scar on your neck, it's a perfect spiral. Within his own mind, Alex begged himself to shut up. He lowered his head and hoped that Arlo would move on. He did not. Arlo placed a finger on Alex's chin and directed his stare back to his captor and offered some words of encouragement. Arlo, often behaving in eccentric ways, began speaking to Alex as if he were a small, innocent child. Oh, please. I'm dying of anticipation. Continue? And as requested, Alex continued, knowing that it could be the last words he would ever speak. So he chose them carefully. My brother Sal. I didn't believe him. Everyone just thought he was crazy. That was before he changed. Then he dropped the whole thing. But I never forgot. You're Marcos. You were born in Petrovka, nearly 100 years ago. Arlo, appearing to be in his 30s, and not as if he could have been born so long ago, added to the confused expressions from Alex's team. He didn't care. He knew he was not mistaken. Arlo interjected and flashed an ominous grin. Please, do go on, he hissed. Alex now had memories flashing quickly before his eyes. He remembered how his brother was such a good man and a very dedicated scientist. He was always trying to better mankind. But then, perhaps age settling in, Salvador started subscribing to off-the-wall conspiracy theories. One of these consisted of the Russian government and a secret alliance with a foreign threat he felt was somewhere in the ethers above. He remembered feeling bad for his brother Saul as he watched his older sibling's intelligence seem to slowly decline as his mind was apparently aging now in a strange direction. But then he remembered his brother suddenly dropping the matter, as he also did the same with all his other conspiratorial ideas. After that, he seemed quite different. He was still great at his work, but he seemed distant, as if far away. But with a new partner at his side, a very sharp woman by the name of Renee Williams, a British scientist, he saw a sizable comeback to his work he had once left behind. But then there was Zancudo. After that, Alex never saw his older brother Sal again. Still though, he was never able to quite shake some of the eerily specific details of his much older brother's rants. One in particular stuck in the young politician's mind. His brother had told him of a small boy who had been attacked by one of these creatures from some other place far away from the cradle of mankind. And now, with Arlo standing before him, he recalled one specific memory within his past. He remembered his brother's words. during a conversation they had within this stage of his brother's conspiracy theories. He looked at his brother across a large marble counter in a very upscale home kitchen. Much younger than him, he gave his older sibling his due respect, but couldn't help a slight sigh escape his lips as he grew somewhat tired of his outlandish lectures. "These things are full of energy," Salvador stated. "Even though the Russians have not let us in on their findings, we still have our ways of seeing within their borders, just as they do with us. And I'm telling you, Alex, this little boy lived through it. And you can tell it's him. Because right under his neck is a spiral scar, a scar as if lightning had struck the body." Alex gave his older brother a confused look as Sal continued his rants. "I've done my research, Alex. I can track his whole life, all the way up to his later teens. He was born in Petrovka. His name was Marcos. But then he simply disappeared from Russia. I think he is here in our country. What's worse is that I am almost positive he has been inducted into our own military. I've been tracking him for a while now, and I feel like I'm closing in on him. This man is dangerous, Alex. He's owned by the Russian government. And to hide him in plain sight, he's leased out to the Kremlin's closest oligarchs. I believe the Russians are containing a virus, and he's going to be the one to bring it here. He can communicate with these things now. But there's good news, Alex. If we can get our hands on him, I think he might be the answer to all our problems." Alex looked at his brother as he slightly widened his eyes. Sal took this as a cue to tell him his theory. Alex, he might hold the cure for the human condition itself. Then Sal leaned back in his chair and looked around the room as if to think. The frustrating part, I just can't figure out how he lived. And after a slight pause, he looked at his little brother in his eyes, and as he spoke his last words, they rang like a distant bell deep within Alex's present mind. "You know, little brother, one day it'll happen. He's gonna be around a long time. You work for a senator now. One day you'll work for a president. You'll run into him. You just wait. You'll see." All these memories happening in just under a fraction of a second sent the president's aide into a state of confidence as he looked up to Arlo standing before him. And now, knowing who he was, he gave Arlo a deep stare of resentment. It was all true, he thought to himself. He then spoke, but this time he spoke as if Salvador was speaking through him. "You're Marcos, the little boy who was half digested by one of those things." Suddenly, Alex felt a cold sensation from his mid-waist spread throughout his entire plexus. He looked down as his head bobbed left and right as he tried to maintain focus. He saw a long knife protruding from his gut, held by Arlo, now kneeling just in front of him. He looked up at him one last time before Marcos slid the cold steel knife back out of his dying body. Everything became blurry as Arlo, once a boy named Marcos, cleaned his knife and responded to the dying man. "Your memories depress me," he said, as Alex gave his aggressor a confused look, while suddenly feeling the presence of this lunatic within his own mind, able to see all his thoughts. Then, his captor's voice sounded once more. This time, however, the voice came from within the dying man's head. "It sounds to me as if you and your big brother were simply not close in his final years. What a shame." Then, he stood up as he threw an angry look at Alex, now keeling over to lay lifeless on the ground. And as Alex slipped away, he heard his captor's voice one last time echo through his soul.
"And the name is Arlo Brooks."